I didn't notice the water at first, just a slightly higher bill, then another, and another. Meanwhile, my neighbor's pool kept getting fuller. Same timing, same days, same hose, always when I wasn't home. The HOA president brushed it off, said it was probably evaporation, said I should monitor my usage better. But when I followed the pipe underground and checked the city records, I realized this wasn't a mistake. She wasn't borrowing water. She was stealing it. And the moment the city got involved, the pool stopped being her biggest problem. The neighborhood was one of those places where everything looked calm on the surface. Clean sidewalks, identical mailboxes, lawns trimmed to the same height. The kind of community that sold itself on being orderly and peaceful. I'd lived there long enough to know that appearances mattered more than people. The HOA ran everything. Parking, landscaping, exterior changes. Even water usage guidelines were part of the rulebook. Most of the time, it was just background noise emails I skimmed, notices I ignored, rules I followed just enough to stay off anyone's radar. My neighbor, though, lived by a different set of standards. She had a large in-ground pool in her backyard. Not new, not modest. The kind of pool that needed constant refilling during the warmer months. And every summer, without fail, it seemed to stay perfectly topped off. At first, I didn't think much of it. Then my water bill started creeping up. Not dramatically at first, just enough to notice. A few dollars more here, then a bigger jump the next month. I assumed it was seasonal. Hotter weather, more showers, maybe a small leak I hadn't noticed yet. I checked my faucets, toilets, sprinklers. Everything looked fine. Meanwhile, the pool next door kept filling. I began to notice patterns. The sound of running water early in the morning. A hose stretched along the side yard, always pulled back before anyone could see where it connected. The timing was too consistent to ignore. When I mentioned it casually to the HOA president, she dismissed it immediately. She said pools evaporate faster than people think. She said water usage fluctuates all the time. She suggested I check my own property more carefully. Her tone wasn't curious. It was condescending. And that's when it clicked. This wasn't just a neighbor issue. This was an HOA issue. Because the woman filling that pool wasn't just another resident. She was the HOA president herself. And if she really was using my water, it meant she either thought she was untouchable or she was counting on no one ever digging deeper. That assumption turned out to be a mistake. Once the suspicion settled in, it was impossible to ignore. Every time I heard water running, my attention snapped to the side yard. Every time my neighbor stepped outside with a towel over her shoulder, heading toward the pool, I felt my jaw tighten. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was pattern recognition. I started documenting everything. Dates, times, meter readings, photos of the hose when it was left out just a little too long. I checked my water meter late at night, then again early in the morning. On days I wasn't home, the numbers jumped. On days I stayed in, they barely moved. The difference was unmistakable. Still, I wanted to be sure. I hired a plumber to check for leaks. He found none. I shut off my main valve one afternoon and watched the meter anyway. It still turned. Slowly, steadily, as if something else was pulling water from the line. That's when I followed the pipe. It ran underground along the fence line, older than the HOA, older than half the houses on the block. It branched in a way I hadn't noticed before toward my neighbor's side yard, toward her pool equipment. When I confronted her directly, she didn't even pretend to be surprised. She said the line had always been there. She said it was probably shared infrastructure. She said I was overreacting. Then she reminded me, casually, that she was the HOA president. The implication was clear. When I went back to the HOA, I brought my notes, the photos, the meter readings. I asked for a formal review. I asked for access to the utility records tied to the neighborhood. They stalled. They said it would take time. They said these things weren't simple. They suggested mediation. Meanwhile, the pool stayed full. My next water bill arrived, higher than any I'd ever paid. That's when I stopped asking the HOA for permission and went straight to the city. The utilities department took my call seriously. They scheduled an inspection. They pulled historical usage data. They compared my account to similar homes on the block. The numbers didn't line up. The inspector came out one morning, clipboard in hand, and asked a lot of very specific questions. He traced the line himself. He tested pressure. He checked flow rates. He didn't say much while he worked. But before he left, he told me he'd be filing a report. Within days, the city issued a notice requesting access to my neighbor's property. That's when the panic started. The HOA president sent an email to the entire community about ongoing infrastructure evaluations. She accused someone without naming me of making false reports. She warned that misuse of city resources could lead to penalties. It was a bluff, and it didn't work. When the city inspector returned, this time with a supervisor, the truth came out fast. The line feeding the pool was connected directly to my meter. No easement, no agreement, no shared utility designation. It was unauthorized use. For months, possibly years. The city shut the water off to that line immediately. The pool pump went silent. And suddenly, the HOA president who had dismissed everything couldn't stop talking. She claimed ignorance. She blamed prior owners. She insisted it was an honest mistake. The city didn't care. They calculated back charges. They issued fines. They documented the violation. And they sent copies of everything to her, to the HOA board, and to me. The pool started draining the next day. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about water anymore. It was about accountability. Because once the city got involved, the question wasn't whether she'd stolen water. It was how far the consequences were going to reach. The neighborhood noticed immediately. A full pool doesn't drain quietly. Pumps shut off. Water levels drop day by day. And for the first time in years, the backyard that had always looked pristine suddenly looked exposed. Unfinished. Wrong. People started asking questions. Why was the pool being drained in the middle of the season? Why were city trucks parked outside the HOA president's house? Why had the city shut off a private water line? The HOA president tried to get ahead of it. She sent another email. This one longer, more defensive. She blamed legacy infrastructure and claimed the situation was being handled internally. She warned residents not to speculate. She reminded everyone to remain respectful of leadership. That email backfired, because by then, the city's notices had already gone out. Not just to her, to the HOA board, to the management company, and to me. The documents were blunt. They listed unauthorized utility use, back billing estimates, and penalties for tampering with municipal water infrastructure. They included diagrams, meter numbers, photos. There was no room for interpretation. Word spread fast. Neighbors compared water bills. A few realized theirs had spiked too, though not nearly as badly as mine. Others remembered seeing hoses running across property lines late at night. Small details people had ignored suddenly made sense. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. For the first time since she'd taken over, the president didn't lead it. She sat at the end of the table while city representatives explained what had happened. They clarified that the HOA had no authority to reroute water lines, that the misuse wasn't a civil issue, and that liability didn't disappear just because someone held a volunteer position. The room went quiet. Questions followed. Who approved the connection? How long had it been in place? Who benefited from it? No one answered. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Some looked genuinely shocked. Others looked angry, not at me, but at the person who'd put them all at risk. That night, another letter arrived. This one wasn't from the city. It was from the HOA's legal counsel. It stated that the HOA would not be covering any fines related to the water misuse. That responsibility would fall solely on the individual involved, and that the board would be reviewing its leadership structure immediately. The HOA president showed up at my door the next morning. Not confident, not dismissive, just tense. She said there must be a way to smooth this over. She suggested reimbursement. She hinted that we could avoid further escalation if I stopped cooperating with the city. I didn't respond, because at that point, it wasn't my decision anymore. The city had already flagged the case. The utilities department had referred it for enforcement review. And once something reaches that stage, it doesn't quietly disappear. By the end of the week, the pool was empty. A large orange notice was posted near the equipment pad, citing violations and requiring compliance before any reconnection could occur. The HOA president stopped attending neighborhood events. Her car stayed in the driveway, curtains drawn. The silence was loud, and it was clear that the story wasn't heading toward a quiet settlement. It was heading toward a reckoning. The final blow didn't come from the HOA. It came from the city. Early one morning, a marked city vehicle pulled up in front of the HOA president's house, followed by a second truck carrying inspectors and a representative from the Utilities Enforcement Division. Neighbors noticed immediately. Phones came out. Curtains shifted. This time, there was no inspection, no measuring, no tracing lines. This was enforcement. The city official knocked once, waited, then knocked again loud enough for half the block to hear. When the door finally opened, the conversation stayed outside. Calm, professional, unyielding. They handed her the notice. It listed unauthorized diversion of municipal water, prolonged misuse tied to a private meter, and tampering with infrastructure without permit or easement. It included a calculated back billing estimate that ran into the thousands. It also included penalties for each month the misuse continued. And then came the part she hadn't expected. The city representative explained that because she held a leadership role in the HOA at the time of the violation, the case had been flagged for potential civil action. Not criminal, but serious enough to involve attorneys and formal hearings if she chose to contest it. She tried to argue. She said she'd assumed the line was shared. She said she didn't know the water came from my meter. She said no one had told her otherwise. The inspector didn't raise his voice. He simply pointed to the documentation, the diagrams, the inspection notes, the timestamps, the fact that the connection had been deliberately routed, not accidentally shared. Then he said something that shut the conversation down completely. He said that intent no longer mattered. Only responsibility did. By the time the city vehicles left, the outcome was clear. She was ordered to reimburse the full cost of the water usage. She was fined for infrastructure tampering, and she was required to pay for the proper rerouting of the pool's water supply under city supervision before it could ever be filled again. The pool stayed empty. The HOA board met that same week. This time, it was brief. She resigned. No speech, no explanation, just a quiet update posted to the HOA portal stating that leadership changes were underway and that future communications would be handled by interim management. The woman who had dismissed my concerns, who had told me to monitor my usage better, who had believed her position made her untouchable, was suddenly just another resident. And for the first time since the water bills had started climbing, everything went still. Because the truth had finally caught up with her. Not through confrontation, not through retaliation, but through records, oversight, and consequences she couldn't talk her way out of. The pool never refilled that season, and everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly why. After her resignation, the neighborhood felt different. Not louder, not celebratory, just calmer. The emails stopped. The passive-aggressive reminders disappeared. The HOA meetings became shorter, quieter, and far less dramatic. Interim leadership focused on maintenance and budgets instead of enforcement and appearances. My water bills returned to normal the very next month. The city refunded part of what I'd been overcharged once the reimbursement went through, and they installed a small lock and seal on the meter line to prevent anything like it from happening again. Everything was documented. Everything was final. No more guessing. No more monitoring. No more wondering where the water was going. The former HOA president kept to herself after that. She avoided eye contact. She stopped hosting gatherings. The pool stayed covered and used, a constant reminder of how quickly entitlement can collapse once it's exposed. Neighbors talked quietly about it for a while, then moved on. But something had shifted. People felt more comfortable asking questions. They challenged vague rules. They requested written explanations instead of verbal warnings. Authority was no longer assumed, it had to be justified. And that made all the difference. What stayed with me most wasn't the fines or the resignation. It was how easily the situation could have continued if no one had paid attention. If I'd accepted the excuses. If I believed that holding a title meant someone couldn't be wrong. The city didn't step in because of anger. They stepped in because of evidence. And that's the lesson I took from it. Power only works when no one checks it. The moment it's measured, recorded, and questioned, it weakens fast. The water kept flowing where it was supposed to after that, and the neighborhood finally felt like a community again.